to talk about the Transfiguration, I think it's necessary to talk about the stories on either side of it. So we'll start with the first one. To get in the right headspace, maybe consider if it's ever happened to you that you thought you were right about something, but you were actually wrong. And then you were really wrong and corrected in real time by someone and super embarrassed. Because that's the space Peter is in this story. Jesus asks his disciples, well, who do people say that I am? And Peter says, oh, the prophets. And then he says, but we think you're the Christ. You're the Messiah. And Jesus says, correct. And that means that I'm going to pick up a cross and I'm going to suffer and going to die. And then Peter says, no, that's not what you mean. And no, that's not what's going to happen. I know what the Messiah means, not you, Jesus. Peter's so wrong, and Jesus looks at him and says, it's something that must have turned Peter's face a Valentine's Day red. Get behind me, Satan, right? You don't know what you're talking about. This whole thing is about a cross. And I'm going to pick it up, and I'm going to carry it, and I'm going to die. And guess what? If you're my disciples, you're going to do the same thing. And I think most of the disciples probably agreed with Peter and were left super confused. Is Jesus the Messiah? Maybe not. The Messiah, that's about kingship and power and not about death and dying. That's crazy talk. Maybe we're wrong about Jesus. 6 days later, after that, Jesus took Peter and James and John, and they went up a moderately high mountain, and Jesus was transfigured before them. I think there's a direct correlation there. I could be wrong. I'm open to that. Feel free to correct me in real time, I guess. That Peter's air actually opens the way for the Transfiguration. And I love the fact that Peter is always among the inner disciples, that even though he makes a horrible mistake about who Jesus is, he's invited into this Transfiguration moment. A wonderful reminder that no matter how wrong we are, Jesus is never finished with us and always inviting us into more. And there's something that the disciples need about this moment on the mountain as Jesus turns this kind of white, his garments at least, that defies description. If you've ever had a holy moment, it often defies description. The best they can do is he kind of was radiant, it was bright, but it's stunning. They're terrified. It's a moment that the holy becomes visible. And now they may not know what it means to be Messiah, but boy, they know Jesus is it. It's a clarifying moment. You cannot doubt as two dead people from the Hebrew Bible stand talking to him, and everyone's alive with radiance, that Jesus is somehow connected to God. That this is somehow the real deal, and there is no other truth beyond this. This makes it into all three Gospels almost verbatim. It was very important. Somehow, all the things the disciples knew about Jesus would run back through this moment to be clarified before being interpreted again. And poor Peter, he's terrified. They're all terrified. He doesn't know what to do. And he says, let's build some shelters. And everybody likes to rag on people, which I increasingly have no time for, just personally. I just think he's very honest. And he's following his own tradition, right? In the Hebrew Bible, when someone encounters the holy, they build an altar there. Jacob has a dream about a ladder. He builds an altar. There are constantly altars set up at places to mark where the holy became manifest. Peter just wants to somehow mark this holy moment. And since it's not the place that's holy, but the people, you got to build them shelters, not an altar. And I think there's just something very real about this moment. Peter suddenly has clarity about who Jesus is. He just wants to stay in it forever. I don't think it's some spiritual high necessarily. I think he's terrified, but I think right in this moment, he knows Jesus is the Son of God. Doesn't matter what that means or anything else. He just knows it's true. And I think it's a human propensity that when we finally have clarity about something, when we finally think we know who we are or something about the world or about God, we want to build a shelter there and just stay in it. Just stay in it forever, because it's easy and it's comfortable and we're clear. Most of the world isn't like that. And Peter's not allowed to build a shelter. The voice of God interrupts them. And I don't know, was it booming? Was it like something they all just felt inside at the same time? Was it melodious? The voice of God says, "This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him." Kind of mirrors the baptism. Except in Mark at the baptism, Jesus alone hears, "You are my son, the beloved." Here, it's for the disciples. "This is my son, the beloved." And this is the only time they ever receive an imperative in the gospel. Listen. Listen to him. And I think that's the most important thing actually about the Transfiguration story. Listen to him. And then they blink and it's all over before it started in a kind of like, did it happen? Was Moses here? Was Elijah here? Did we all dream that? Are we off our meds? Like what happened, right? And then Jesus says, "Don't tell anyone." I always find that strikingly unnecessary. Who would they tell that would believe them in the first place, right? Like, either the other disciples are going to think they're making it up to feel special, or like no one's going to believe them. Anyway, I imagine they come down the mountain in silence. I don't understand a world in which you could encounter something that holy and then you'd want to talk about it. It would kind of kill the fire within. And so they're quietly coming down the mountain, maybe perhaps wanting a lot of time to think about what has happened. Wouldn't you want some processing time to assimilate mentally what in the dickens you've just experienced and seen? That's not how it works. They come down the mountain, and can you hear the noise? There's like a cacophonous shouting and heckling, and it's getting louder, and then suddenly they're in the middle of a whole huge mess. They walk down, and there's this young boy who's got a demon. He's having a horrible traumatic time. His dad is like red in the face, yelling at the disciples. The disciples are yelling at each other. They're trying to heal this boy. They can't. The father is mad. Somehow the Pharisees are there because, of course, your frenemies would be there to see your low moment. And they're heckling the disciples, right? People are on the margins watching this happen. And if the disciples, James and John and Peter, wanted a moment to think, it's just bypassed them. And Jesus strides into the center of it, and unlike in other healing stories, he actually begins to ask some questions of the Father. How long has your son been like this? What's going on? Why couldn't you heal him? And it seems strange, but I actually think Jesus is trying to calm everybody back down. Everybody's operating from this kind of outward, frenetic frenzy, and he just needs to get them back in their heads and slightly more rational in order to engage them and not make it wilder. That's what the voice of God does. And everyone there begins to listen to it. And he's engaging with the Father, and the Father has this profound moment where Jesus says, "Do you believe it's possible?" And he says, "I believe, help my disbelief." And from my part, I think it's just such a deeply true expression. Here is this father who wants to believe the Torah, who's trying to live a life that God is present to him, and every day he watches his son suffer. And it's like having his heart outside of his body, watching his boy. And now these disciples were supposed to heal him, and they didn't, and is he supposed to believe, and can he believe, and could you just help me believe, but I don't disbelieve, right? It's not the clarity of the mountain. It's the murkiness, the morass of real life. And the voice of Jesus heals the boy, right? The demon and all of the people, they listen to the voice of Jesus. And the boy is made well. And maybe for a moment, the disbelief is overcome. And maybe the clarity of the mountain is still present with the disciples. And I guess I struggle every year with this text, and I feel personally annoyed that every year I have to preach on the Transfiguration, because I find it difficult. Jesus is glowing. Great. But it happens on this mountain, and I have no access to it. And the message seems to be a little bit like, we can be a lot like Peter, wandering around, thinking we have the truth about God. We're finite. And we wander around and we err all the time about who we say God is. Because so often we want God to be who we think God should be, in the image we think God should have. And the text seems to indicate that we could be there for a while, but then somehow there's a moment of clarity that comes, a transfiguration moment that happens. I need to disabuse you, though, that this whole chasuble thing doesn't come with like a glowing mountaintop experience. Maybe you've had one. I feel like the best that I get are these moments where somehow I just feel in the deepest sense somewhere in the gut that is true. They come unexpectedly as going up a mountain and suddenly, crazy things happen. And maybe it's true for you. Some unexpected moment and you just know in your deepest place you do believe it, that it's real. The cross and the resurrection and the Trinity and 2 and 3 and it doesn't make sense. 2 natures of Christ, God is 3, okay, I don't know. But you have a moment, clarity. And I always kind of want to stay there too long. I want it to last longer than it lasts. I want to build a shelter there where I think I finally understand something about something. But then it's over. And if you try to build a shelter in that, you just live in the past, in a place that isn't. And there's no peace in that. And then I think the truth of the Transfiguration is listen to Jesus, because, we're not worshiping a God that's stagnant. Jesus is on the mountain glowing. He doesn't stay there. He walks back down, unglowing, into the mess of everybody's lives. And it's really in the mess that we live, where we're constantly trying to listen for the voice of God, trying to find and remember that piece of clarity we had, because it's difficult. It's difficult to watch people suffer in our backyard in houses they're forced to live in, or globally in wars and in famines. It's difficult when our friends are ill or we're ill. It's difficult trying to explain the difficulty of the world and why people don't like each other or why violence happens. I believe, but good grief, help my disbelief, right? Walking that paradox sometimes seems to be the truest point of my life. I believe, help my disbelief. And then the voice of God speaks into it. And I wonder how often I'm listening. The Transfiguration maybe isn't always a glowing, it's a deep conviction that accompanies us into the world. And maybe the truth of it all is Jesus saying, listen, listen. In the murkiness, in the morass, listen, I am there. I don't really know. Maybe that's a cop-out for this. Or maybe the question is more important than the answer. Then it leads us to the God who sometimes takes us to the mountain and sometimes, most of the time, is just with us in the valley. I do believe Scripture speaks. And I hope that somehow this story speaks to you. And that you hear God saying, this is my Son, Jesus Christ the Beloved. Listen to him.